Hey, geography students. Today we are moving on with our talk of development and looking more into the factors that industrialization plays in terms of development and how the Industrial Revolution kicked off this series of advancements leading to an overall higher quality of life around the world. Additionally, we'll take a look at Rostow's model in terms of how developed each country is, and he basically equated it down to particular stages, right? So, or steps that countries go to along the way. What stage of development and industrialization is your country in is what we're looking at. All right, so let's take a look. We'll first start off by talking about industrialization, and that includes the industrializing or the factory-based process of manufacturing goods or creating goods to sell. All right. So industrialization is the process of moving different types of goods that are being produced out of the home and into factories and are mass producing them on a large scale basis, right? If you've learned maybe about the assembly line method or some of those processes, this is what we're talking about. And so this is relatively new in terms of world history, but um, roughly around 1800, some countries began to industrialize or creation of these large-scale factories that employed a lot of people and allowed them to produce things much more efficiently than individual people or groups in their homes. And so prior to that, most people just had very basic, goods being produced at, by hand or so with basic hand tools. Now we're seeing large scale machinery, an assembly line method, different advancements. You have better transportation, such as the train, as well as other types of tools and inventions that kind of fuel this industrialization. And this allows more people to work in the secondary sector. Right. So remember, the primary sector is agriculture and extracting natural resources. The secondary is taking those natural resources and turning them into a final product. And so they are going to be mass producing these goods. And today, what that looks like is that we have different stage of industrialization. Some countries went through the industrialization a long time ago, like Britain and America. They went through it in the 1800s, that industrial revolution. And so today we've not only industrialized, we're post-industrialization, and we have highly advanced factories that produce high quality and very expensive goods, you might say, very advanced technologically. And then in other parts of the world, they're within the industrialization process, such as China, India, and some other countries like that, that are producing, not quite as advanced goods, but quite a bit of different products. So think like textiles, or basically the clothing materials, or any type of fabric, right? So wherever your shirts and clothing comes from, these types of countries, they're going to be mass producing basic goods. And because they're in a mostly industrial economy. And then some countries are pre-industrial, where very poor countries around the world are, still in the primary sector phase, where a large portion of the population is living on subsistence agriculture, or growing just enough food for themselves, and have not moved into the industrial phase, which accompanies a higher quality of life, higher wages, and other benefits to industrialization as well. So here's a quick map to show you where the most industry is located. Notice it's not in America. We are industrialized, but remember, we're in that post-industrial stage where most of our jobs have moved into the tertiary sector. Most of our factories are automated in that they're produced by machines, and they're also very high-tech goods that don't require a lot of individual people to work these different types of factories. Whereas in other countries that are in the dark blue here have a high number of people working in factories that do very basic tasks within the job and do require a lot of individual people to work there. So in countries like China and Iran and Russia, they have a lot of factories there that require a large amount of human labor on top of the machines that work there as well. Okay, so a good way of thinking about it is that the most advanced countries or the highest levels of industry or the secondary sector are going to be your developed countries, but not the most developed countries, right? Because the most developed countries are post-industrial now. Like Canada, the U.S., Western Europe, some of those countries. Okay. All right. So just a quick reminder. We've talked about this a little bit before. But prior to the Industrial Revolution, most people produced goods in their home, right? They had these basic tools and they could produce quite a bit more goods than they would prior to a lot of these different inventions. But they were not as efficient as these large-scale factories, which had bigger, more expensive machinery. They had more people that worked there. They could form an assembly line method and produce a lot more goods at cheaper prices. And overall, the business would make more money. So these original factories were in the home, and they called them cottage industries. And these were very small scale and were not very efficient. And so they realized quickly that factories were much more efficient. And so one of the effects was we have large amounts of factories moving in. People left their jobs in agriculture and moved into the cities where factories were located because you have high population. So it means more cities are going to pop up as well and higher populations in those cities. We see a large amount of natural resources being consumed from things like coal, and then later on, would be oil used to power these factories and machinery. And we also see technological advances and inventions help to improve productivity and produce a lot more goods. This allows these factories to become more economically efficient, hire more people, and overall, more people in the economy are making more money, and so the quality of life improves, right? Because the more money that people have, they can spend that on the things that they need more easily, and therefore, their overall ability to have access to food and medical care and pay for those services increases. It also allows people to specialize in, say, things like medicine, and right, more people are able now to become doctors because they're not spending all their time, working on, providing enough food for their family. So more food, right? The factory production increases food output as well as consumer goods that are being produced in the factories. Think like the early factories would produce things like clothing or basic food supplies. And so this would allow people to overall increase their access to food, things they can buy at the store, and the overall wealth in the whole country increases because of these factories. So industrialization had a positive effect on the economy and allowed countries to develop more quickly. So the countries that did develop, right, have a higher quality of life, and it puts them all further along this stage of development. Right. It also moves people out of the rural areas where they would spend most of their time, like farming, and more people live in urban centers. So one thing to consider is that overall in the world, the urban population, or people living in cities, is growing. And one of the main reasons why is because around the world, less and less people are working in agriculture because of all the technology. More people are moving to cities because they either work in the factories or in service, tertiary-based jobs. And so urban populations are increasing around the world, right? And so this would eventually diffuse, right, or move from the original location like Britain to other countries like the United States and Western Europe, like Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, and others. And so, and then more recently has moved into other parts of the world, such as South America, Asia, and parts of Africa as well. And so the countries that developed first, right, had the Industrial Revolution first, are the ones that are typically more developed today. And so it's a process that we see is that countries aren't able to be considered a more developed country until they've gone through the process of industrialization. And it's a long process, it takes years and years and years to do. And so once they are able to go through that process, they naturally see their quality of life improve and their HDI increases. Right. So to give you an idea of what it looks like today, most Western European countries like Britain and France and Germany and others are post-industrial, have gone through the industrialization a long time ago, as well as countries like Japan, Canada, Australia. They are post-industrial. Newly industrialized countries, or countries that are currently in the industrial phase, are countries like China or Singapore, Taiwan, Turkey, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa. These countries are more developed than, say, like our sub-Saharan African countries, but they have not moved past the high end, high advanced goods and services like they have in the post-industrial societies. All right, so here's another map that shows you these, right? So developed, highly industrialized, or post-industrial countries in the dark blue, currently developing and industrialized countries in the light blue and teal, and then underdeveloped countries that have not industrialized yet, or not at a large scale at least, are in red. All right, so next we're going to look at the different stages of development, because like I said, Rostow, which is the guy we're going to talk about that came up with this model, noticed that each country goes through a general process of industrialization. And there's these different steps that each country takes along the way. And as they move through these stages, they become more developed. Right. So one way to look at it is, actually I'm going to skip through some of these stuff, is this Rostow model. Right. So think of the first step as like before industrialization happened, all countries were in this traditional society that everybody was subsistence farming. They were growing just enough food for everybody. Everybody worked in the primary sector. There was no real industrialization at all. Very few societies are still in the traditional society or stage one today in Rostow's model. Right. So traditional society, that's stage one. And then the first thing that happens is they start, countries that is, start building things that they need in order to take off, right, in terms of industrialization. So they're starting to move away from, farming and start to see the first building of factories and cities and roads that are necessary in order for factories to, take off. And so people are in the process of starting these facilities, but they're not there yet, right? There's maybe a few factories and things like that around the country, but not quite there yet. Now, in the takeoff phase, we're seeing a rapid growth now of industrialization, where we see a large number of people moving out of the primary sector into the the secondary sector and moving into manufacturing, and lots of factories here. Okay, then they move into the drive to maturity, or stage 4, where we see the majority of people in the country now not only work in the secondary sector, but also more people and technology are increasing, that less people are needed in the factories themselves and are moving now into the tertiary sector and providing more services instead. And then the industrialization spreads throughout the entire country and not just a few central locations. And then finally, countries reach what they call stage 5, or high mass consumption, where basically technology has taken over. There's very few in terms of factory workers these days because of the advancements, and they get to a point where most people work in these service or tertiary based jobs and no longer really work in the factories, like I said, anymore. And they have large amounts of consumer goods that are easily accessible, and a country is basically fully developed. So think of countries like the United States, right, in stage 5. Right. So let's see if I can give you a few examples. Okay. So based on this Rostow stages of development, the traditional society, like I said, there are very few today. That would be countries like Sudan or Afghanistan, Papua New Guinea, like you saw in Guns, Germs, and Steel. Those would be countries in the traditional society where most people are just basically eking out a living and not very advanced. Then we have some countries that are starting to develop and going to be taking off here soon, which would include countries like Pakistan, Nigeria, Ghana, and Sub-Saharan Africa. There are some countries, that are soon going to, quote unquote, take off or have a large amount of industrialization in their future. Countries that are currently going through that takeoff period would be like China. Mexico and India have a large amount of factories and industrialization. That's why a lot of your goods are made in these countries, right? If you see like made in China or made in Mexico, this is why, right? Because they have large amounts of those types of factories, basic goods. Things like your clothes or things you'd see in Walmart to buy, a lot of those are made in those countries. And then some countries are, past that stage where they're producing like high tech goods, like they're moving out of like making clothes, and now they're making like phones and washing machines and cars. So countries like Singapore, South Korea, Qatar are making those types of goods. And now, finally, we see the high mass consumption stage. Stage 5 would be like the United States, Japan, Western Europe, etc. They're in this stage 5, high mass consumption. And we're seeing these countries are producing the highest tech goods only and providing more services instead, because technology has replaced the need for human labor in these factories. And so they only need to produce very few of the basic jobs that are required in factories. They're also producing higher level goods. So think like America's factories build like cars and airplanes and computer systems and all kinds of very high tech things. We're not producing shirts. We'll just buy that from another country. That allows us to make more expensive goods that makes us more money, if you want to think of it that way. Okay. But the overall thing I want you to see is that all countries started off in stage 1, right? The US was in stage 1 in the 1700s, pre-industrial revolution. But then slowly over time, the countries move from stage 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. Eventually, all countries are going to be in this high mass consumption stage. Okay? And so that will be difficult in terms of the earth and natural resources, but it is doable. But that's the general trend. Right? So the general timeline looks like this, right? So 17 to 1800s is when the first countries started industrializing, and then the U.S., U.K., as in Britain and Japan, finally reached that high mass consumption stage about 150 years later, all right, to 200 years later. So this is a long process. This takes a lot of time, although some countries do go through the process faster than others, but it does take quite a while to go from stage 1 to stage 5. But eventually, once they do reach these, and as they move along these stages, it allows them to have a higher quality of life, and their HDI is going to increase with it.